Hey there everybody, it's Mark Crowley. I'm back with another video. Let's call it Add Color Digitally. Now, I decided to bring this into the video even though this is not a video about digital coloring. I just thought if I don't get this in here at the start, the comment section is going to be filled with people saying, well, it's easy to avoid making this really my video about traditional coloring. This other piece of advice that tends to be in every one of my videos, but I can't be sure that this isn't the first video for some of you watching, and this advice is 0.5. Study the color choices and coloring techniques of artists you admire. Do a copy of one of their illustrations to unlock their coloring secrets. You just learn all this stuff all by yourself, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Number one is this. Use high quality paper. When using watercolor, thick paper is essential. I like smooth surface Bristol, but different artists have different. You use office paper or even something that claims that it's artist's paper. Very often that stuff is very thin, and so that's interestingly, before we even get into the color advice, I wanted to start with the paper, because sometimes, you know, a bad paper choice is your undoing right from the beginning. Alright, so let's move on now to number 2. Test your colors on a scrap piece of paper before applying them to your final artwork. The scrap paper and the final paper should be the same type of paper, and indeed right now I have a scrap piece of paper that I can test my... Let's get on to number 3. Try doing one or more rough versions of the entire picture to figure out your overall color scheme before moving on to the final art. Work from light to dark. It's way easier to make a light color darker than to make a dark color lighter. And if you've drawn something in pencil that already looks completely finished in black and white, it may already be too late to add color successfully. Advice number 6 here. Consider beginning to add color early in your process. Or midway through, rather than saving all the coloring until the end. Kind of an Number 7. If you plan to ink first before adding color, test to make sure your ink won't smear when the color goes on top of it. I often ink last, an approach worth trying if you've never done it before. Number 8. When using markers, test the colors first and let them completely dry, since the color often changes during the drying process, to see what the final color is before you apply it to your finished artwork. I'm switching to a smaller brush here because I'm trying to get to the sort of seed. Beware of the color shown on the marker, casing, watercolor tube, etc. It can be radically different from the true color. Now, to number 10. Some markers in a factory set are, in my opinion, too dark. Just because someone decided to include them in a set doesn't mean you have to use them. Hey there, everybody. In many cases, layered colors are more beautiful than big, flat areas of color that came straight out of the tube. Pale colors can be layered successfully, while super dark colors leave no room for a second layer. Illustrations, like for example this one with the leaves. It's the layering that's making the leaves on the strawberry look more convincingly real. And that layering is only possible because I started with very light colors and I had somewhere to go on top in terms of building it up. Okay, well, we're getting closer to final stuff. I think what I'm going to do though is let this dry, and I'm going to switch to colored pencils as I give out the final pieces of advice in this video. Alright, so I'm coming in with colored pencil here to begin adding a bit of shading on top of the watercolor, as so often I do. And I'm a little torn with this video in terms of how specific to go with my advice. There's a lot of advice I can give that's specific to watercolors or to colored pencils. I think I'm going to save that for another video. This is more sort of the general advice, specifically geared towards, avoiding the problem of ruining a drawing when you add color. So please forgive me if I don't talk too much in detail about colored pencils or watercolors. Watch this space. I will hopefully be able to do a video like that in the months ahead. Let's move on now to number 12 on my list of advice here. If you have never done color mixing, combining blue and yellow to make green, etc., give it a try. A custom-made orange can be more subtle than the shade that comes out of the factory. Combing? I do apologize. This is supposed to be combining. Ugh. Anyway, color mixing, it's such a basic thing. They teach it to us in kindergarten almost, blue and yellow makes green. It's worth playing around with that. It isn't just for little kids. It is indeed something that professional artists are doing all the time. And I do remember using when I was in college, I was using a straight from the tube orange to paint an orange, the fruit, right? And my teacher back then, David Small, came along and said, hey, that straight out of the tube orange is not going to be as interesting as an orange that you mix up yourself using yellow and red. And he actually took all of these secondary colors like purple and green and so forth and almost took them away from me and said, here you go, blue, right, red, yellow, black and white, here's your colors, this is all you can work with now. And it was kind of a revelation to me, and it's worth having that in your bag of tricks, the ability to mix up the colors the old-fashioned way. Sometimes it'll give you a better or a more interesting shade of color than if you just used the color that came straight out of the tube. Let's move on now to number 13, which puts us almost to the end of my list here. There's nothing wrong with mixed media. Try combining, hey, I spelled it right this time, what do you know? Try combining markers with colored pencils, watercolors with pastels, etc. You can see me doing mixed media right now. Just know that you don't have to try to get all of your effects with markers. I think there's a lot of effects that are very hard to get with markers, for example. And I've been using mixed media for years, sort of leaning on each type of media for the thing that it does best. Colored pencil, for example, as I'm doing right now, is great for detail work. You know, you get the sharpen that pencil, you can get all these tiny little seeds or whatever. But in terms of creating a base layer of red, very time-consuming, and maybe I'm struggling to cover up the white of the page because there's a certain texture, and the colored pencil, you know, short of pressing down with all my might, is not going to give me that base layer that is such a natural thing when you do it with watercolor or markers. So if you can afford to have multiple types of coloring tools, give mixed media a try. And you may notice that there's no piece of advice in here that's about talking about the quality of your materials. I was tempted to say use the highest quality materials that you can afford, but I just felt, you know, a lot of people just blow way too much money on art supplies. Art supplies can be very expensive, and I just don't like the idea of people going bankrupt over art supplies. I think you can actually, you know, I would say get at least halfway decent art supplies. You don't need top of the line. I just sort of like, maybe my philosophy of life, I don't like the idea of you needing to blow a lot of money in order to be a good artist. I think that you can get there with relatively inexpensive art supplies. Well, we are coming up to the very last of my pieces of advice, but before I do that, I think I need to do a little time lapse as I complete my color work on this strawberry, and then we're going to be back with the very last on my list of pieces of advice relating to coloring. Alright, so you can see I put a lot of extra time in there. I'd say at least a half an hour adding finishing touches with colored pencil, moving back in with watercolor, sometimes even dabbing things away. You can add water to watercolor and use a tissue or something to sort of pick a little bit back up off the paper. Hard to completely erase watercolor, but you can lighten it up a little bit that way. Anyway, we can now finally move on to the final piece of advice, and that is this one, number 14, for highlights. Try using white gouache. Everyone knows I love white gouache. Even just a few touches of it can make a huge difference. I find that it needs to be among the last steps in the process, and indeed I have saved it for the last step in this process. And this is what a tube of white gouache looks like. I'm using Winsor & Newton. This stuff is not cheap, I'll be honest. I can't remember exactly what it costs, but it's. I feel it's worth it. I've tried inexpensive white gouache, and it just doesn't come off onto the paper the same way. So, in spite of my desire to keep it inexpensive, I would say in the realm of white gouache, maybe you do have to break open the wallet and go for something a little nicer. But you can see me using the white gouache to add these little highlights, and you know, especially in an illustration of a strawberry, that little glimmer of light as it pops off of the surface, the shiny surface of the strawberry, makes a huge difference. And as I sort of said in my piece of advice, it's surprising how a little goes a long way. You don't really have to have loads and loads of it. You can just sort of put in a few drops here and there. You don't want to overdo it. But I think you're seeing already a kind of an illusion of, you know, the glimmer of light as it hits that surface can make a surprisingly big difference. And I think maybe that's going to bring us towards the end of this video. Let me go ahead and grab my books so that I can thank anyone who has supported me by getting them. The Realism Challenge, this is definitely the book that contains the most instruction that's like what you saw in this video. But we also have The Drawing Lesson, my graphic novel that teaches you how to draw, Mastering Manga 1, 2, and 3, and my latest book, Manga Art. The very latest book is, of course, called Chibi. Hope to have a copy of that. It's taking a little while, but let's go ahead and lay down this brush. I want to thank you all for watching this video.